Hi everybody. My name is Timira Hudson. This is the first episode of my podcast. I don't know how many episodes there will be, but today I'm joined with, say your name,
Sue Macdonald.
and she is a very, very special guest. So, so what's your profession?
So right now I'm a freelance writer. I've been doing this for about a year and a half, and this comes at the end of a 40-something year career that I spent as a newspaper journalist, a marketing and public relations writer, a social media analysis and consultant, and then a marketing writer for a healthcare company right before I retired about a year and a half ago.
Okay. So, before we start, is there anything you'd like to say?
You know what? The one thing that I always say, and the reason that I met you was I talked at your career day at your school. The one thing that I always say to people, especially younger students or people who are trying to figure out what they want to do, for the rest of their life, is to just find what you have a passion for and go for it. I think a lot of times people are either told that they have to do a certain career or follow a certain career path or, start in a certain profession or take over the family business. And it's really important to just find what you love and do it, because then you'll do it well.
Okay. Well said.
Thank you.
The first question is, what was it like being a journalist?
It was the best job ever. I think I was glad that I was a journalist when I was a journalist. I graduated from college in the late 1970s, and I stayed in the newspaper business until the year 2000. And that was a time, it was right after Watergate, when investigative journalists had found out that President Nixon had been involved in wiretapping the Democratic Party headquarters, and he had hired robbers to break into them, and it was a huge cover-up. So there was a lot of respect for journalism at the time. And it was before the internet. There was no internet back then. That didn't really come into play until the late 1990s. So we weren't competing with CNN for 24/7 news and who can get the loudest headlines. I mean, journalists really were respected back then. We weren't always liked, but people pretty much respected the profession. And it was our job to kind of keep an eye on government officials and public officials and schools and every other institution, and to just write about our communities, get out there and write about people who are making good things happen, and volunteers who are doing great things, and conservation efforts and all sorts of things. So it was a great job, because I got to meet so many different people and write about so many different things, and every day was something new.
That sounds like so much fun.
It was a ton of fun. It really was. I still hang out with a bunch of people that I worked with back then. We're all in our 60s and 70s now, but we still get together pretty regularly for lunch, and we all sit around and we just say, you know what, we were journalists when it was the best time to be journalists in this country. And everybody, every town, every big city had at least one newspaper. Most of them had two. In Cincinnati, we had the Cincinnati Enquirer, where I worked, which was our morning newspaper, and then the Cincinnati Post was an afternoon paper. But a lot of cities had two major newspapers, so we were always out there competing for the news, and writing about what's happening and trying to reach the most people with the news we were writing about. So it was a really great job, and I got to meet so many people. That's the one thing that I really feel grateful. And it was everybody from bums on the street corner and people at, homeless shelters, to people running for president, city council members, leaders of corporations. As I mentioned in your class, when I talked to your class, I got to interview Fred Rogers, who was Mr. Rogers on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the television show on PBS. He was my favorite all-time interview, because he was just so real, just such a pure human being, and so much fun.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just something different every day. That's what I really loved about it.
So, what were the cases that you liked to do?
I spent most of my time on the feature staff. So there was a news section, there was a sports section, there was the feature section. In the feature section, we covered everything from what musical concerts are taking place in Cincinnati, what's at the theater, what's at the symphony, and then all of the lifestyle issues. So we wrote about, child raising and family issues and what's going on in the arts community and medical news and healthcare news.
Mm-hmm.
In the last 15 years, I guess, that I was at the paper, I was mostly the health reporter. So I wrote a lot about health and how to keep yourself healthy and how to keep yourself fit. And there were I don't know if there was one favorite story out of all of those that I covered, because every day it was something new. But as I mentioned to your class, I did do a series of stories about this 13-year-old young man who had died of brain cancer at Children's Hospital.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And as his parents were cleaning out his bedroom, they found a diary that he had left, and they didn't even know he had been writing it. Mm-hmm. And this had been going on for like 4 years, that he had been writing about what it was like to have cancer. Oh. And so I did a 6-part series. I interviewed his parents about what it was like, and his doctors and the nurses and the teachers and everybody who knew Christopher. And it was just a really touching, heartwarming, sad story. But it had a good ending, because the diary ended up getting published by Children's Hospital, and they would give that to other kids who had just been diagnosed with cancer and their families, or to teachers in schools where maybe a kid who had been diagnosed with cancer and then was coming back into the classroom. They could use that diary to help them learn about what it was like. I never got to meet that little boy. I wish I had, but just hearing the stories about him was just really, really, really touching. And that's probably the thing I'm proudest of that I did in the 22 years that I was there at the paper.
That's good. What year was that?
That was 1997.
Oh, okay. So...
He passed away in April, and I think I got the call from Children's Hospital just a couple weeks after he had died.
Oh.
And we ended up talking to his parents, and they were just very open and gracious and willing to talk about what kind of kid he was and what it was like, when he was diagnosed and how he struggled with the cancer. But from what everybody said, he was always upbeat. He was always looking on the bright side of life. He always wanted to have fun. He didn't want to make anybody sad. He just sounded like a really amazing little kid.
Do you feel like you were ever really connected with the people, like the families of the people?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I've stayed in touch with tons of people that I interviewed.
That's good.
I still have lunch with people. They could have been people that I interviewed. The interesting thing about this little boy with cancer, just a couple months ago, I got an email through LinkedIn from a guy who said, "I'm looking for Sue Macdonald, who wrote this series of articles about my nephew back in 97. Is that you?" And it turned out that this was his uncle, who's a pastor at a Baptist church, and he's writing a book about Christopher, because apparently good things are still happening. People still remember him, and people are still doing things at his church.
That's good.
So I got to meet him. I met up again with Christopher's dad, and Barry was a really huge part of the whole series, because he was really open and really honest about how difficult it was to watch Chris go through what he did. But I keep in touch with not a ton of people, but the ones that I really connected to after the story published, and there was no longer a conflict of interest for me to be friends with them. We've become really good friends.
That's really good.
Yeah.
So what were the cases that you disliked to do?
Oh, the ones I always didn't like is when usually it had to do, there would be a shooting or some kind of a family event that involved the police. Somebody was killed, somebody was shot, somebody was injured, and the editor would always come to whoever was in the newsroom that night and say, can you call the family or can you go to their house and see if they'll talk? And it's, when you always see those reporters with microphones, sticking their microphones in front of people who are going through something really difficult, and they're asking stupid questions like, how do you feel? And what was it like?
Yeah.
It just felt really invasive and impersonal. I didn't have to do that often, but when I did it kind of begrudgingly. I didn't really want to. The one time that I really remember, it was a man who had been killed at work by another employee. And he was an older man. He'd worked at this company for like 30 years, and some guy who worked with him at work showed up with a gun and shot a couple of people. And one of the guys they sent me out to talk to his family. I was as polite as I could be. I called him on the phone ahead of time and apologized for interrupting them. They were very gracious. They were like, we want to tell his story. If you want a picture of him, we want his picture in the paper because we want people to remember, who he was and how much of an impact he had on our family and neighbors and everything like that. They were very gracious, but that didn't happen very often. Most of the time, people would just hang up on us, and I probably would have done the same thing had I been in their shoes.
That's understandable.
Yeah, that's a tough time for anybody. You don't want to have to deal with a reporter who you've never met before asking very personal and invasive questions. So that was the one thing I didn't like about it.
So, what type of cases were interesting to you?
Everything seemed interesting to me. I guess I've always been one of those people that I always want to learn new things. I was always kind of a science nerd in school. So when I started covering healthcare and consumer health, I interviewed a lot of doctors and scientists, mostly at UC Medical Center and at Children's Hospital here in Cincinnati and some of the other hospitals. And I was always fascinated by that, especially when they'd invite me to come into their lab and show me what they were doing or let me sit in on a surgery and watch what they were doing. Those I found really interesting because it just kind of tapped into that fascination with science that I've always had and still have. I liked interviewing people that were doing good things. For a couple of years, I did a weekly column called One Good Turn, where what my goal was to go out and find people who were volunteering to do stuff in Cincinnati. So it might be a lady who was working at a soup kitchen down in Over the Rhine every Wednesday. So I would go down and interview her while she was working at the soup kitchen. One guy that I interviewed, there's I guess quite a few people in the Jewish community that on Christmas Day would go to hospitals and to volunteer at the hospital so that all of the Christian volunteers and employees who wanted to leave or wanted to be at home with their families or go to church or mass or whatever could do that. So these Jewish people would go and fill in on Christmas Day so that the Christians could attend their churches and stuff like that. So there were always just these really... One day I followed a guy out in Loveland. He jogged in his neighborhood every day. And he always took a garbage bag and one of those grabber sticks, and he would just pick up garbage along the way. Every day he would come back with a bag full of garbage because that was his way of keeping his neighborhood clean. So it was just fun stuff like that. People doing cool stuff to make Cincinnati a cool place.
And what were the cases that were boring to you?
Oh, covering government meetings.
Oh, yeah.
Going to Coleraine Township trustee meetings or school board meetings where they would just go on and on and on and not really talk about anything at all. Planning commission meetings, some city council meetings, you're just kind of stuck there until the meeting is over. But the important thing is that we were there. As a newspaper, we were there monitoring what was going on. Finding out what was on the agenda. What are citizens complaining about? What new development projects are coming in to communities? Who's applying for permits to build this or that? It really was a great way of monitoring what was going on in different communities. And I think because the news business has changed so much now that a lot of that, I think we've lost a lot of that vigilance. Like government officials aren't held as accountable as they used to be because there aren't reporters at their meetings all the time. And like every Wednesday when I worked up in Butler County, every Wednesday morning, the Butler County Commissioners meeting, was held, and somebody had to be there to cover that. We were there for city council meetings, school board meetings, court hearings, all that kind of stuff. And it was boring, but we had to be there, and sometimes you'd find a great story from it.
Okay. So this wasn't a question that I planned, but it got me thinking about all the stuff you've been saying. Mm-hmm. Would you say that over the span of your career, you've been to a lot of different places when you interview people and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the places that you would go?
Well, most of my career was, all of my career was at the Cincinnati Enquirer in journalism, so all of that was around Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. I think I had to fly to Detroit once to cover some legal case. But all of it was just in town, visiting people in their homes, going out to different businesses, going to offices, people that were doing stuff, going out to parks, writing about people who were doing cool things in the parks. I can pretty much get to anywhere I need to go in Cincinnati without looking at a map, because every day I was out covering something, going somewhere. And again, this was back before the internet, so we couldn't get on Google and look up places or see what it looked like. We actually had to go out there and visit people in person and knock on their doors and sit in their houses or meet them at work or, wherever. So there were tons of places in Cincinnati that I got to see that I never would have seen otherwise. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Sure.
So what were the most, gruesome cases?
I wasn't on the police beat, mm-hmm. So I didn't have to go out and cover any of the, accidents or murder scenes. I'm trying to think, even when I worked in Hamilton, Ohio for the first 3 years right out of college. I don't think I had to cover any gruesome things there either. There were reporters that were assigned solely to the police beat, that's all they did. Mm-hmm. Nothing was gruesome. The only thing that would have been gruesome was sitting in on surgeries. When doctors would let me sit in the operating room, but I was kind of fascinated that, it wasn't yucky to me. I was like, oh wow, that's what the body looks like inside when you cut it open and look inside. But I never covered any murders or fires or mm-hmm. things like that where there were accidents or injuries or deaths or anything like that.
So what were some of the things that stuck with you positively?
The cool thing for me was once I explained to people what I was doing or why I wanted to talk to them, most of them were always really willing to sit down and talk to me. Because a lot of times I think once people would hear, oh, she's a reporter, don't talk to her. Mm-hmm. But I always found that if I was kind of a human being first and a reporter second and kind of explained why I wanted to talk to them and what I wanted to talk to them about, they were like, okay, fine, come on in. And people would tell me things that were hard for them to talk about. Mm-hmm. One woman in particular, I remember, she had written a book. She worked for a social service agency in town that helped kids who were in, trouble with the law or foster homes or whatever. And she had written a book about being abused as a child by her father. And it was something that, she really hadn't told anyone when she was a kid. And the book was beautifully written. And I just remember sitting in her living room, and she was really open about what she went through, but she wanted to do that so that other kids wouldn't have to go through the same pain that she did. And it took about, I don't know, I think I sat in her house for 2 hours, and it probably took a good hour before she trusted me enough and knew that I wasn't going to ask anything, or that if I did ask something that she didn't want to answer, she could say, no, I'm not going to answer that, and I would respect that. And she was one of those people, we became friends too. I've kind of lost touch with her over the years. But she was just a very sincere, well-meaning lady. And she ended up running a program where she would take troubled teenagers out to a camp somewhere out in Appalachia in eastern Ohio, just to get them out into nature for a week and teach them that there was a different way of coping with whatever crap they had gone through in their childhood or with their parents or, whatever.
That's really cool.
So it was nice that people would open up and talk to me. And the weirdest thing, though, was when they would recognize me on the street, because at the time when I wrote those columns, my picture, a little headshot of me ran with my column in the paper. And sometimes people would come up to me and go, oh, aren't you Sue Macdonald from the Enquirer? And if I was if I hadn't really done my hair or I looked terrible because I just gotten out of the shower, sometimes I would think should I say no? She wouldn't show up in public looking like this. But, I was always happy to meet people because a lot of times they had a story idea they wanted to pitch my way. So I would talk to anybody about anything.
What were some of the things that stuck with you negatively?
I probably the negative stuff doesn't have to do anything at all with what I wrote about. It had to do with how the newspaper industry changed. Once the internet came into play and once people could get news on their computer and not from the newspaper every morning, that the people who ran and owned newspapers didn't really know how to compete with the internet. And that's when, instead of trying to be kind of unique and solve the problem of how do we keep our readers, they just started cutting staff and closing down newspapers and cutting staff and closing down newspapers. And that's what's happened today.
Yeah.
I think when I left the Enquirer in 2000, we had somewhere between 175 and 200 employees in the newsroom. So that would have been news aides, reporters, editors, photographers, people who did the newspaper layout and design, graphics people. I think there were somewhere between 175 and 200, and now, from last I heard from the Enquirer, there's 40, and it's just not what it used to be. So it was more frustration with how the business of publishing and newspapers couldn't stay up with the times. And a lot of what happened is that I think when I started, and for a long time in U.S. history, most of the newspapers were owned and operated by families who had a long history in journalism. The Hearst family published Hearst newspapers. Knight Ridder was the Knight family and the Ridder family, and they published newspapers all over the country. And over time, they sold out, and they sold to venture capital companies and investors who didn't really have any interest at all in journalism. They were just interested in making money from the advertising. And that kind of has led to the downfall of journalism, newspaper journalism anyway.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Just watching the business kind of tank is the worst thing for me.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah, because it was a great job while it was there,
So this is the last question. Do you think that journalism has made you a more compassionate person and more sensitive to people's feelings and what they're going through?
Oh, for sure. For sure. It has, I mean, I grew up on a farm in Northwest Ohio, in a small town of like 10,000 people. I was real shy as a kid. And being a journalist, just it forced me to get over any shyness I had, and to really meet every person from every walk of life, every neighborhood, every income level, every nationality, every foreign language. And it really just makes you realize, like, we're just all the same. You know, we're just all one big soup of people running around trying to keep our lives in order. And so I think it made me more compassionate. It definitely got me over my shyness pretty quickly. I think that happened even in college, because I worked for the college newspaper at Miami University here in Ohio. And I think it made me appreciate Cincinnati, just because there's so many great people here, and it really is a cool town. I mean,
it is.
I haven't lived not many other places, but I always come back to Cincinnati because there's just really nice people here, and a real good sense of community and pride, and, you know, keeping things moving and going forward and not looking back and holding on. I think we do a really great job here of holding on to our past, but looking forward too, which is what I like about Cincinnati.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome. It was great. I'm so glad we got to meet. That was meant to happen.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
So is there anything you want to say as like an exit ticket card, something?
You know, just what I said at the beginning, whatever you have a passion for, go do it. You know, you're going to be a happy employee if you like what you're doing, and the people who work around you are going to be happy if they've got a happy employee next to them. And it really does. It does something inside you. It makes you feel like you've contributed something good. So find what you have a passion for and go do it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Good luck.
You too.
Mm-hmm.